Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. Clodagh, we're going to start tonight with the closing speeches from Conor McGregor and James Lawrence. McGregor first, and Remy Farrell, senior counsel, is representing him.
Yeah, so his closing speech began around 11 o'clock this morning and went on for 1 hour and 20 minutes. So he began his closing speech by addressing the jury, telling them that he wasn't going to treat them to some flowery adoration or dramatic speech. Instead, he was going to invite them to review the evidence in the case. He said, what is the case about? He said, if it's about anything, it's about the evidence. He said, you've been given an issue paper that sets out the questions that you have to answer. He said it's not about some sort of hot take or your gut instinct or what the colour writers in the newspapers say or even a soundbite. He said it's about the evidence. It's not about vindication. It's about the closing questions on the issue paper, that and nothing else. He said one of the things the plaintiff, particularly in terms of the opening statement and regarding the letter from the DPP that was put in evidence, so this was in terms of the opening statement from her legal counsel, Mr. Gordon, at the beginning of the trial. He said that that DPP letter was put in evidence. He said it's a significant part of the evidence. It's the only significant part of the evidence that is, and it's the only form of vindication that she can get. But that piece of evidence signifies that something wrong happened. Right?
So this refers to the fact that the DPP considered the case that was sent to them by the Gardaí. Mr. McGregor was arrested in the January after this incident, which Nikita Hand claims was rape and he denies, and reviewed the investigation and came back and said that there was to be no criminal charges brought.
Exactly, yes. So we heard in evidence during the course of the trial that there was these letters sent back and forth between the DPP and Nikita Hand. So when she got their direction of no prosecution, she then sent a letter to them asking, appealing it and asking them to reconsider the matter. And that was rejected by them. Now, those letters were read to the court. So in his closing statement today, Mr. Farrell went on to say that in that particular letter between the DPP and Nikita Hand, she claimed that Mr. McGregor was not being prosecuted because he was rich and famous. But he said it doesn't matter what the DPP thinks about the case. It matters what the jury thinks after they go through all the evidence. He said that's why the issue paper is significant. He went on to speak to them about the oaths that they pledged in relation to giving the verdict in accordance with the evidence. He said in relation to you can't give evidence, you can't come to a conclusion based on your gut feelings. He said, even if you may not like Mr. McGregor is somebody that's hard to avoid, and he elicits strong views. Some people love him and some people do not love him. He said he's not backwards about coming forward. He says maybe you as a jury or all of you may have negative views before you. Some of you might have an active dislike of, some of you might loathe him, and there's no point in pretending otherwise. He said, in the jury system, we don't question you about his views. He went on to reference O.J. Simpson, so the jury in that trial being quizzed for weeks about their views and what media they consumed before that they were admitted into the jury. He then said, I invite you to give consideration to, he says, what might be a euphemism, but the fact that Mr. McGregor has a forceful personality. And he said, we're not immune to the fact, and we do have ears. He said, when Mr. McGregor gave his evidence and he said in his evidence, and this is in relation to when he got contact from Nikita Hand, and he got a photograph from her. He said, we heard an intake of breath in the jury box, and you might take distaste to the use of the word bombastic, which was his description of Nikita Hand and Danielle the morning that he met them. He also said you may or may not have hugely appreciated the hand gestures he made about the picture that was sent of Miss Hand. And he said in relation to the two lovely ladies comment that he heard the intake of breath from the jury box. He also said that they might not appreciate that a man who leaves his family home on a Saturday night and it might not endear him to them. He said, I'm not here to ask you to like him. I'm here to ask you to look at the evidence, and I'm not asking you to invite him to Sunday lunch. He asked them to interrogate their own views and said that it shouldn't matter if McGregor, if they like him or not. He asked them then to work their way methodically through the evidence. He said, look at the CCTV, look at the text. He also said that to cross-reference those and work out exactly what's happening in the different points of time. He then then pointed to some silent witnesses, he said, which were the points of evidence that don't lie and can't be contested. He said that's a useful place to start when you're looking at the evidence. Work out the bits that cannot be contested in relation to the time, the CCTV and the text messages. He said, look at what we call the islands of fact. He said, what I'm asking you to do is you can't ignore the who of all this, but I'm suggesting to you to look at the how and the why, the when and the what. You have to answer the question, did Mr. McGregor assault Miss Hand? And he said rape was included as a form of assault. He said, there's no doubt, whatever way you find this case, if you find for Mr. McGregor, that'll be devastating for Miss Hand. And likewise, if you find for Miss Hand, that's going to be devastating for Mr. McGregor. He said, there's a winner and a loser here. But again, he said, it's all about the evidence. He says, if you approach this on a basis of who you'd like to win and who you'd like to see win, that's not your oath, he said. He said, judges aren't allowed to say themselves who I like and who I don't like. And he said, that it's not their duty to do so either. He said that it's not easy to ignore the consequences of your decision. He said some juries have to work harder than others. He then said you're going to work through a lot of evidence, and again said you're not here to give a hot take or go with your gut. He then asked how do you go about it? He said that's up to yourselves. He said the jury does how they see fit. Juries are not committees. He said each of you had to be satisfied on a balance of probabilities. He said Miss Hand has to prove on a balance of probabilities 51% is the standard there, more probable than not, that her evidence and her account of events are true. He said what it may mean in practical terms is to break down the evidence and look at the specific issues. He said it may be helpful to you to ask, did this thing happen? Probably or probably not. He said when you look at something and there's two versions of events, you need to use the probably or probably not as a useful framework. He said you were told by Mr. Gordon that the case was simple. He said it was a single issue of rape, and this is again referring back to Mr. Gordon's opening statement. And he said that Mr. Gordon had told him that there was a lot of noise surrounding it. And he said what you heard at the start, after you've heard of all the evidence, do you think that's right? Do you think all the other stuff is just noise? He said that in relation to this, he was talking about, he was referencing the CCTV, the text messages, as well as James and Danielle's testimony on the stand. He asked if the CCTV evidence was indisputable or was it just noise? And again, in relation to the text, he asked the same question. He asked why the jury were being asked to regard those things as noise. He says, is the evidence of Danielle Keeley just noise? He said that she's a witness who was described by Miss Hand as a friend. He said, is all of that just noise? He says the reason he puts that to them is because the approach to the plaintiff in this case was to suggest that it's all very simple, that she was raped and everything else is a distraction. He told the jury that they were in a privileged position in terms of the CCTV so that they can see the aftermath of what happened or allegedly happened in that room with Mr. McGregor. He said you can make your own assessment of it. He went back to reference Mr. Gordon's opening statements. He suggested that her actions were delayed shock. He also said that this would be something that they would need to consider, and invited them to answer a simple question. Is the plaintiff's consistency and credibility shown in the CCTV from the hotel or from the CCTV in the ambulance? He says if the CCTV from the beacon is noise and the CCTV from the ambulance is not noise, he said he wasn't sure how that works on that one. And he says coming into the end of his statement, he said there was one final issue in relation to the noise. He said the accounts that Miss Hand gave, her first and her second, in the first one she gave Miss Brennan, which was Emer Brennan, whose home she went to on that evening after she was allegedly raped in the hotel room. He said it was quite clear from her evidence that Miss Hand invented an account of rape. When Miss Hand presents herself at Emer Brennan's house at an ungodly hour, she says Miss Brennan knows to keep record and remember elements of the account she gave, Miss Hand gave her at the time. Notes that Miss Brennan took, she said that while she had taken photographs, in her own evidence, she had said while she had taken photographs and Nikita Hand asked her to delete them, she did actually decide in the days after to make a written record of what Nikita had told her on that night because she thought it could come in handy in future. And he points to this. He said that in her account, she said that she woke up and there was two security guards in the room, and she left because she thought she was going to be gang raped. Then he said the evidence of her waking up and apparently remembering nothing. He said, how could these two things be true? The second element of this, he says, was Nikita Hand telling Emer Brennan that when she gets up and Danielle Keating is gone, and he said there's no sign of Danielle, That's what she's telling Emer Brennan at this stage. Emer Brennan, however, has noted her saying that she looked for Danielle and Danielle wasn't there. He said that she tried to airbrush Danielle Keely out of the case. He pointed to speculation that she didn't want to give her name to Gardaí in the Rotunda Hospital because she wanted to remove her from the story. He also said that at this stage, she doesn't know whether or not Danielle Keely heard or perceived anything consistent with rape in the hotel room. And not knowing that at this point, she says she seems to airbrush her out of the story completely. He said, what is it that Miss Hand knows at that stage to put Danielle Keely in the middle of what was going on? How could she know from the early hours of the morning that Danielle Keely wasn't going to back her up? He said Miss Hand knew full well that with the account she was given made no sense if Danielle Keely was there. He said it's because in Nikita Hand's version, she's jumping up awake thinking she's going to be gang raped. He said, don't take my word for it. We all know these are things that did not happen. He said it's also a very important feature of what she said to Emer Brennan. There was no suggestion of memory loss or blackouts or anything like that. He said the suggestion that she'd forgotten the rape when she wakes up is what he was referring to there. He said, interestingly, rather than accounting for Danielle Keely, who was there, she says that James Lawrence was there and has herself reporting to James Lawrence what allegedly happened with Conor McGregor. He then added that a third element of what she said to Emer Brennan, she told the driver she wanted to go home. The driver asked, did Conor want her to leave? And she said yes. He then added, we know she didn't want to leave, but she wanted to continue on in the hotel. He said, you have 20 minutes, half an hour of Miss Hand very much not wanting to go home. Again, is this some confession on Miss Hand's part? The fourth element of that, he said, was she ran off because she thought there was a security guard in the lift that was going to rape her. Emer Brennan said she walked into the car park with a security guard and she thought she was going to be raped. So she ran out and got in a taxi and tried to go to Ballyfermot, but instead ended up at her home in tears. And at this point, there was no so-called blackouts. He then referenced back to Mr. Gordon's opening statement in which he said that during cross-examination, she would give her account, but during her accounts on the witness stand, to many, she responded, I can't remember, and I was confused. He then references when she goes to Emer Brennan's house. On the stand, she was asked what happened, and she said she didn't remember. And then he said to the jury, ask yourself, is that initial account, is it confusion or is it just pure fantasy? He said that one thing that might help you is the CCTV and you will see that the security guard got a hug. He then went on to say that when she gives her account to Stephen, there's no suggestion then of memory loss. He said that the recording was played as part of the plaintiff's case, but during cross-examination, he said you might want to put more weight on it because of that. He also said, bear in mind that the interaction with Steve isn't long after leaving Miss Brennan's house. He says you might want to consider the sheer number of lies and you might want to highlight and count the lies and consider how persistent they were. She then told Stephen on multiple occasions, he told me he'd kill me, and this is in reference to the man who raped her, telling her that he would kill her. He said that this comes up then, but it never pops up in the case again. He said that she repeats the lie to Stephen about being in the taxi with Emer Brennan, and he says that this is a text she sent before even getting to Emer Brennan's house and asked, was it to account for the fact that she was in a taxi with James Lawrence? When it comes to consistency, he asks the jury, you might want to look at the two people she reported it to. Emer Brennan first, who made the record a couple of days later, and he said that it was either fantasy or Miss Hand was remembering things that just didn't happen. He then references the recording that Stephen made and said it's replete with lies. Again, pointing to the fact that in that recording, she said she was in the Morgan Hotel when rather she was in the Beacon Hotel in Sandyford. He then told the jury that he recently came across a word and it was truthious, and he defined it for them as something that's not true but sounds true, it rings true and has a lot of detail. And he said this in relation to the one detail that Nikita Hand said she was being insistent on, and that was being choked 3 times. He said, is it consistent in the way you might say the Irish soccer team are consistent, except when they lose 5-0? It suggested that it's something you cannot make up. He then went on to explain that Miss Hand never mentioned going to Las Vegas. Of course, the being put in a chokehold 3 times is in a reference to something that Mr. McGregor said during a fight that he lost when he tapped out in a few months beforehand. However, when cross-examined about her knowledge of MMA or UFC on the stand, Miss Hand said she didn't know anything about it. However, it was brought to the attention of the court that she had been on a trip to Las Vegas in 2015, the year prior. However, she did tell the jury that she was not at the match. She was just in the area. He then goes on to tell the jury to take a look at the whole picture. Turning his attention to James Lawrence, he said one question they need to ask themselves is in relation to, did she have sex with him or not? He said that he wasn't going to say much about it. He would leave it to his legal counsel, but he said he was going to put it to them that she was alone in a room with him for hours, and then leaves the hotel with him. Mr. Lawrence says they had sex. CCTV then shows them the affection between them. And he said if you got into a lift with Nikita Hand and James Lawrence and the way they were conducting themselves, would you have told them to get a room? Would you make assumptions that they were romantically entangled or had sex? He said in relation to her refuting this, he said the cons of coming to the truth on this matter, Miss Hand said that she wouldn't have sex while she was on her period. She didn't find him attractive, and that she wouldn't have done something like that. He then goes on to ask, what does the CCTV say about it? He said that she finds him irresistible. He said, I'm not sure what charms he has, but in her evidence, she said, that's not me. And he said, not to criticise anyone's morals, but this is not a case about morals. He said, look at the perspective of who's more eager, who's chasing who, and this is in relation to the CCTV footage within the lift. Then in relation to the tampon, he said, one thing is clear from start to the end of the CCTV footage, from 6 onwards, after she'd been allegedly brutally and violently raped by Mr. McGregor. He said she is in no discomfort. In relation to the DNA, he said there's none for Mr. Lawrence. But then posed the question, was it because he was responsible enough to use condoms? He then said in relation to the suggestion that he was a patsy, he said you'll find no suggestion that he is the patsy in the case, but you will see Miss Hand setting out that she was sexually assaulted by him. He said you may be scratching your head, how can someone bring Mr. Lawrence to court and then say, I don't think I ever had sex with him? He said if you're scratching your heads, you're not the only one. How would you feel if it was you, your brother or your son that this was made against them? He said it's something you have to think about. He said Miss Hand is in a position to sue somebody for rape. She said she never had sex with. He said something that was a feature of Miss Hand's evidence was she was saying, I just see a drunk, vulnerable woman. He said, when you look at that CCTV, he said, did you see someone who knows what they want, setting out about getting what they want? And he says, I don't mean that in a critical way either in relation to Nikita Hand. He said that she was someone who was well able to lie. He said there was a number of lies you can choose from here. He said, I want to make the point that it's not a crime to lie. He said that was a valuable point that Miss Hand had made previously in her own testimony. But he did say sometimes there's a good reason for lying, but ask why the lie was being told. He said, start with his text messages, particularly the one in the early morning when she asked Steve, is it okay to go out with everyone from work? And then as well, from the suggestion, he said, in relation to the CCTV, she said that she looks like somebody who's vulnerable. However, he puts it to the jury that she is someone during this entire process who is lying. He said the single and most important lie is at 18:28 when she's down in the basement. She gets very vivid. She gives a very vivid account on the stand of when she woke up in panic, worrying about the time. She said Mr. McGregor's watch didn't work and hers didn't work, so she had to grab her phone from her bag so she could text Steve. And she did. She texted him saying, so drunk in the goat, haha. And when she recounted this, she also remembered that she had no shoes. He said that she had a very clear recollection of sending it. She said she knew everything that was sent, yet everything she said is flatly contradicted by the CCTV evidence. So he invited them to look at the sequence of time in relation to her being in the basement, spending time on her phone and cross-referencing those timestamps with the timestamps of the texts. He said she spent an awful lot more time on the phone that can be accounted for. So one of these included a 3-second call to Mr. McGregor, and then she texted Jen and then she texted Steve. She said what else is she doing during this period? We don't know, because her phone, she subsequently deleted messages from her phone. He said one of the last things she does in that time is send a text to Steve, and he said that she wasn't particularly concerned about him at this point. He rings Mr. McGregor then, who's just left, before she even calls Steve. And she does a little victory dance at this point. He then says that she finishes the business that she was doing on her phone, does that victory dance, and get back to engaging with James Lawrence. In the account she gave in January of 2019, she told Garda in an interview that she panicked, she went over to her bag, checked her phone, and remember texting him, "I'm fine, I'm so drunk." She says she did this because she didn't want him to worry. She said the feeling at the time she has was worry about him. She wanted to let him know she was okay. And he asked, "How was your day?" The first thing she said that came to mind was to tell him that she was okay. So when she woke up, it was like she forgot what happened to her, which is what we heard. And she said she wasn't worried about what was after happening to her. She was worried about Steve. He then pointed to the footage from the basement when she says that she sent the text, and he asked, "Is any of this true?" He further goes on in relation to the text messages, particularly detailing her allegedly worrying about Steve. And he asks, did she lie about where she was, what she was doing? Did she lie about why she sent the text? He says, can you sense any concern on her behalf? He then went on to say, if you can figure out why she's calling McGregor before Stephen and texting Jen before Stephen, you can probably figure out if she's lying. He asked, did she lie to you? As in, did she lie to the jury? Probably or probably not. He then said, if she hasn't lied, then her brain has set up a whole set of images. And there's further text later on that she sends to Emer in the taxi. He then asked the jury, what do you make of Danielle Keely's evidence? And he said, I expect you're wondering where she was, wondering why you didn't hear from her, and wondering why she wasn't called as part of the plaintiff's case. He said that Danielle Keely was in the penthouse, so she couldn't be more relevant to the case. He said, I invite you to look at those pictures and pay attention to the dimensions of the room. He said, how far away is the bed from the interconnecting door? So this is the bed in the bedroom. He said that by Miss Hand's account, she was brutally raped by McGregor in that room. By Miss Hand's account, she's brutally raped by Conor McGregor. He says that there's then a discussion in this room with Mr. McGregor about knowing part of his family. And he says all of this is happening just feet away from the other room. He said, did this happen? Probably or probably not. He reminded the jury that the Gardaí had to get a physical key to operate the door. Miss Keely agreed that in 2019, when she spoke to the Gardaí, she said the doors were not fully shut. He said that's an important data point for a number of reasons, including that Mr. McGregor said the doors were open. In a text she sent to Jen as well, she had said that the room was locked. In cross-examination, she said she didn't know if the door was closed. And Mr. Farrell put it to the jury, why is she making this up? Why is she saying these things at this stage? Is it all noise? He then went back to Miss Hand's reluctance to engage with Miss Keely. He said that a significant feature of this is that she attempts to write Miss Keely out, even in the account which she gave to Miss Brennan, which was the account she gave to Emer that evening. He went on to say that why does Miss Hand decline to mention Miss Keely the next day when asked by Gardaí about the incident? And he also puts the question to the jury, if Miss Keely would back up her story, why not mention her? He then moved on to Mr. McGregor's phone, in which during the evidence we heard it was suggested that he wouldn't give his phone to Gardaí. However, he puts it to the jury that he wasn't actually asked for his phone. Then when he was interrogated about his no comment interview, he said that Mr. Gordon was given permission to pursue that line of query for one purpose. However, he said that the judge would explain that piece of information to them further, but he said, what would you do in Mr. McGregor's case? He said, what would you do? Would you be terrified? He also added that another slightly odd element of the case was in relation to compensation claims for a new house. He said it's slightly odd that we heard evidence of cost of housing in Cabinteely or Shankill. He said it's a nicer area and you might wonder why it comes into the case. He said the judge will instruct you in particular on that. But he said, could someone ask for the price of a new house and relocation costs in their case? And he said it's not a normal part of compensation claims to ask for a new house. He said the last thing for the jury to consider was the question of memory. And he said this is fundamental to Miss Hand's account. He said on the second day of cross-examination, she said, there's certain things I remember and certain things gone out my brain. He said, that's an understatement. It's like somebody has surgically excised some parts of her brain. He then asked the jury, do you believe Miss Hand? Is what she said probable or not probable? He then went on to say, you might have a moment of excitement from when the psychiatrist said something vague about avoidance symptoms and PTSD. He said that in relation to the memory loss, she did not remember the traumatic event in particular, but she remembered the happiness. He said she's hugging, she's smiling, she's dancing. And the psychiatrist, he said, went out in a particular limb to give that piece of evidence. He then said to the jury, I suggest to you that the account that Miss Hand has given is curated. She knew the account Danielle gave wouldn't back her up, and she had to say that she forgot the rape when she woke up. Otherwise, she would have told Danielle Keely that she was driving off with a, quote, rapist. When it comes to having sex with Mr. McGregor while wearing a tampon, he says that she simply pretends she couldn't remember it. He then says, I suggest to you that this is a very carefully put together account, and is it probable or improbable that someone remembers some parts of their evidence and not others. He said, in conclusion, I want to remind you of what was said at the start. Many of you probably don't like Mr. McGregor. Should that matter? If it was anyone other than Mr. McGregor, would the door hit you on the backside before you were out to dismiss the case? And it's that point then, after an hour and 20 minutes, the jury went for a quick comfort break before they returned for 35 minutes of closing for Mr. Fitzgerald on behalf of Mr. Lawrence.
Okay, and Mr. Lawrence was with McGregor that day. He had been picked up at his house in Drimnagh, and he has told the court, and certainly Danielle Keely has told the court, she had sex with him in the main room of this penthouse. He has given an account that after McGregor left to drop Miss Keely home, that he went back up to the room. He says he had sex twice with Nikita Hand. She says she has no memory and does not believe she ever had sex with him. He came forward himself to police the day after McGregor was arrested and questioned in connection with the allegations, and he told them that he had sex with Nikita Hand, who had given statements to the police with no indication that that had happened.
Yes, exactly. So in Mr. Fitzgerald's closing for Mr. Lawrence, he said that he was going to try not to overlap too much in the evidence heard, or well, it's not even evidence, which is something the judge will tell the jury about, or has told the jury about, that these closing statements aren't actually evidence. It's just a summary of the case. So he began by talking about the difference between Mr. McGregor and Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Fitzgerald say that Mr. Lawrence arrived into this case without the fame or perhaps notoriety that Mr. McGregor did. And he said he's lived his last 35 years in relative obscurity and wants to return to it once the case is end. He says himself and Mr. McGregor come to be tried before the jury, not because of who they are, not what you think about rape cases, cocaine, cheating on your partner, or going out on a 36-hour bender. He said, you're deciding this case on your oath and on the evidence. He said, on how you decide, you're going to be given different versions of events. He then goes on to ask, why is Mr. Lawrence here? He said, Mr. Lawrence asked that question himself. The plaintiff doesn't believe he did anything to her, and he's wondering why he's here at all. And he said, that he will deal with this by going through two accounts of the evidence and on the balance of probabilities, which one is a made-up story. Miss Nikita Hand is saying that the made-up story is the fact that she was raped by Mr. Lawrence. He said there's another made-up story that he is somehow the patsy or a fall guy. He said, think of the circumstances. There was a media storm about a sports star alleged to have raped a woman in a Dublin hotel. Ask about the mindset of somebody who would make up a story and end up in that media storm, and if convicted would end up in prison for a significant amount of time. Who would do that? If you break it down, would you say that was a made-up story? Further, then he goes on to reference Miss Keely's testimony in which she said she had sex once with Mr. Lawrence, who says it was 3 times. He said that the time that this may have occurred was within an hour and a half, and he said that's a matter for the jury to consider, whether or not they believe Miss Keely or Mr. Lawrence. He said, what's more important, he said the manner in which they had sex was consensual, conditional, and of an agreed nature, which included the use of condoms, which is reflected in the account of both of them, and was both supported by the CCTV gathered that shows the security guard going to the shop at some point to get the condoms. He then touches on various pieces of evidence that Mr. Farrell went through during his closing statement. He then went on to say that women can have sex with tampons in, but it can become more painful due to infection. He said that there is DNA evidence in this case, in particular those swabs taken by Dr. Murphy, who said semen was tested for DNA, but considering if there was a condom used, there may not be DNA. And he said this may not help you in relation to Mr. Lawrence's case. He then referenced Dennis Desari, who was on the stand, the security guard for Conor McGregor's previous security guard. He said that he got up on stand, he agreed that he went and got the condoms, and he also said that he didn't notice that anyone was in distress. And he said that you may think, oh yes, because of course he worked for Mr. McGregor, of course he's going to say that. He said, if that's how you're going to approach it, how does this apply to Miss Keeley? He said that Danielle Keeley didn't want to admit to having sex with James Lawrence in the beginning, but she did say that they had sex once, and he said 3 times. He said you can see why she wouldn't want to be anywhere near this court. He then said that Miss Hand was going in and out of the room and she wasn't distressed. He then pointed further to Miss Hand giving Miss Keeley a hug before she left. He said that Miss Keeley supported Mr. Lawrence's account in relation to Miss Hand's demeanour, and also in relation to the fact they weren't going to have sex unless there was a condom. He said that the plaintiff in this case is asking you to believe that this is a man who would take advantage of a woman who had been brutally raped. He said, if you accept that version of events, I say it's completely impossible. He said, now with all circumstances to the jury, it's a bizarre case against Mr. Lawrence. He said, to find against him, you have to carve out what suits the plaintiff's story and discard the rest. He said that if you accept Mr. Lawrence's account as shown on CCTV, that they did have consensual sex after Nikita Hand had sex with Mr. McGregor and after Mr. Lawrence had sex with Miss Keeley. He said, if you're satisfied with this, then I suggest you do not find in favour of the plaintiff. And after 35 minutes, his closing speech came to an end.
Yeah, it's a complex case that they have to, as both of those senior counsels have kind of put to them. There's a lot of he said, she said in that, and it's difficult to recount it then because you're putting another he said
yeah.
he said to the jury. So, but nonetheless, that's what both McGregor and Lawrence's teams have said. They're denying outright that they raped Nikita Hand. She has taken the case because she said she was raped. Now, we're going to take a break and we'll come back to what her legal team summed up basically and how they concluded to the jury. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.